After years of treating me like trash, I thought parents were finally treating me well because I proved myself by becoming successful. But turns out it was all just to demand a safety net for their darling daughter and her 6 kids from 3 separate marriages. They cut me off immediately after refusing for being unsupportive and inconsiderate. But somehow everyone in the family found out. I grew up knowing I wasn't the favorite kid. My parents were always more focused on my younger sister, Emma, who seemed to get unlimited chances and support no matter how many times she made questionable choices. I got used to standing on my own 2 feet. I worked hard, put myself through college with a mix of scholarships and part-time jobs, and eventually landed a stable, well-paying job. Even though I had done it all without much help, my parents never seemed that impressed. For years, I tried to brush it off and keep going, believing that someday they'd respect me for being independent. Meanwhile, Emma's life was a roller coaster. She married young and her first marriage ended after 2 years when her husband cheated. She remarried quickly and had 2 more kids, but that marriage also fell apart after her second husband developed a gambling problem and lost their house. By the time I was building my career, Emma was on her 3rd marriage with 6 kids in total, ages 12 to 2. Her current husband works part-time as a delivery driver and is trying to start his own business, but they're struggling to make ends meet. My parents have always been there to bail her out, paying for things here and there and always coming up with excuses for why she needed just a little more help. For a while, I was too busy focusing on my own life to get caught up in Emma's chaos, but then I started noticing a change in how my parents treated me. They became more attentive, reaching out more often, praising me for my career, and inviting me over for family dinners. I thought maybe they were finally proud of me, and part of me had been waiting for this for years, and I guess I was willing to believe they were turning a corner. Last month they invited me over for dinner. At first everything felt normal. We talked about work and caught up on small family news, and for a moment, I almost felt like part of the family in a way I hadn't before. But then the conversation shifted. They began talking about Emma, saying how hard it was for her to raise 6 kids on a single income, how my parents had done everything they could to help, but were running out of resources. They went on about how lucky I was to have a good job and steady income, how I had no one relying on me, and that I was in a position to give back to the family. Then came the bombshell. They wanted me to step up and take care of Emma financially. They had a whole plan worked out. First, they wanted me to buy her a new 5-bedroom house because her current rental was too cramped for a family of 8. They wanted me to set up college funds for all 6 of her kids, which, as they pointed out, would really only be fair since I was the one who could afford it. They wanted me to provide a monthly allowance of $5,000 to cover basic necessities and give her seed money to start a mommy blog business. In total, they expected about $2 million up front and then ongoing support. I sat there completely stunned. This wasn't some small favor they were asking for. This was a lifetime commitment, essentially treating me as Emma's financial safety net. I realized in that moment that their recent kindness wasn't because they finally valued me as their son. It was because they saw me as a walking ATM for Emma. I told them that while I was willing to help with occasional small expenses or in case of emergencies, I wasn't comfortable taking on such a massive financial responsibility. At that point, the calm, we're all family talk flipped entirely. My mom started crying, saying I was abandoning family when they needed me most, and my dad outright called me selfish and ungrateful. They said I was showing my true colors and that they were disappointed in the person I'd become. The dinner ended with them storming out. I thought that might be the end of it, but I was wrong. Within hours, Emma started bombarding my phone with texts accusing me of ruining her children's future. She even had her kids send me messages saying things like "Uncle doesn't love us anymore." It was overwhelming, so I blocked their numbers after a while. I couldn't believe the situation had spiraled this far, all because I refused to bankroll my sister's life. The next day, my grandmother, my dad's mom, called me out of the blue. Apparently, my parents had been going around telling the whole extended family that their successful son was going to take care of everything for Emma before they even asked me. They painted this picture to everyone about how Emma was moving into a big new house, how all her financial worries would be over, and that I would be the one providing her with everything she needed. Now that I'd refused, they were facing a massive wave of embarrassment as the family expected me to come through based on my parents' premature bragging. My grandparents were horrified when they found out the full story. They'd always assumed that Emma's lifestyle was supported by her various husbands and that my parents helped out by choice, not because they'd run themselves into debt supporting her. They were so upset by my parents' behavior that they're now threatening to cut my parents out of their will. They told me they'd rather leave their estate to me and my cousins, who actually work hard and don't take advantage of others. As this whole mess started circulating through the family, I began hearing from relatives who reached out in support. Some of them said they had no idea how much I'd been dealing with on my own and apologized for not seeing it sooner. My aunt, my mom's sister, even called me saying she was sorry for not noticing how differently I was treated growing up, The family dynamics were starting to implode with everyone choosing sides and my parents were not handling it well. My phone started ringing non-stop again, and this time with my parents alternating between angry, bitter messages and tearful voicemails. They were furious that I was destroying their reputation within the family. At one point, they left a message saying I was ruining Emma's children's lives and that I would regret this decision someday. Then they'd switch back to begging me to reconsider, saying things like, "We're family and family helps each other." All this has left me feeling like a mess. Part of me feels guilty because I was raised to believe family comes first, and it's hard to break away from that conditioning. But another part of me is exhausted realizing just how long I've been trying to earn approval from people who only seem to care when it benefits them. The realization stings, but I know that if I give in now, it'll only mean years of being financially and emotionally drained, putting Emma's needs ahead of my own life. Now I'm here, turning to Reddit because I genuinely don't know what to do next. Do I stand my ground and keep my boundaries knowing it's the healthiest thing for me? Or is there some compromise I'm not seeing? I could really use some important advice on this mess. Update 1. The situation with my parents and sister has turned into a mess beyond anything I could have imagined. Just a couple of days after I shared the whole story with my grandparents, they weren't bluffing about changing their will. They actually went through with it, contacting their lawyer almost immediately to make sure my parents would be removed from their inheritance. My grandparents have always been the quiet, keep the peace type, so this wasn't just shocking, it was unheard of in our family. But apparently, this situation with my parents and their years of favoritism towards Emma was the final straw. My grandparents also took things a step further and called a family meeting to set the record straight. They arranged it over call so that everyone could attend, including me even though I live further away. They wanted everyone to understand exactly what was happening, and from what they hinted, I had a feeling they were going to say some things I didn't even know myself. The meeting included a few aunts, uncles, cousins, and basically anyone who was close enough to be affected by all this. When the meeting started, my grandparents didn't waste any time. They immediately revealed that over the past several years, they had been sending my parents substantial amounts of money to help both me and Emma with our education and future plans. In total, they'd given my parents more than $200,000. Assuming it would be split between Emma and me to support us equally, I was speechless. I'd worked my way through college with scholarships, student loans, and multiple part-time jobs, struggling to balance work and classes, while Emma seemed to live on a different planet, barely lifting a finger, constantly being bailed out of every bad decision. All those years, I'd been doing everything on my own while my grandparents had been sending money that I never saw a cent of. My grandparents were furious. They had assumed the money was helping both of us, but now that they knew how my parents had been using it, they felt completely betrayed. They'd been clear with my parents that they wanted to support both of us, but it turns out that money had mostly gone towards Emma, covering her failed marriages, rent payments, and who knows what else. They demanded a full accounting from my parents on how every dollar had been spent, threatening to involve lawyers if my parents didn't comply. For a family as private as ours, this was an unthinkable move, but I could see they'd been pushed to their limits. On top of that, my grandparents announced that they would be setting up trust funds for each of the grandchildren, including Emma's 6 kids, but they made it clear that this money would be professionally managed by an outside trustee and could only be used for specific things like education or healthcare. It was obvious they didn't want my parents or Emma getting anywhere near these funds, which felt like a huge relief. At least I knew Emma's kids would have a shot at a stable future without my parents draining those accounts for other things. After the family meeting, everything exploded. Relatives started reaching out to me, one after another, as they began putting pieces together. Apparently, this wasn't the first time my parents had taken money from family members under the guise of helping the kids or supporting family emergencies. An aunt told me she'd loaned my parents a few $1,000 back when Emma's second marriage fell apart, thinking it was for essential needs. Another cousin mentioned my parents asking for money around the time I went to college, saying it was to help me get started when in reality I never saw any of it. Some of them were angry, feeling misled about where their money went. Others were just sad, saying they hadn't realized the full extent of how much my parents had favored Emma over me. One of my cousins even showed me screenshots of conversations with my parents from when I graduated from college. They'd actually discouraged family from coming to my graduation, saying that I wanted to keep it small and didn't want a big fuss. Meanwhile, I had been hoping my family would show up and celebrate with me. It felt like a gut punch to see how much they'd actively tried to minimize my accomplishments while constantly going all out for Emma. But what surprised me most was that Emma herself started reaching out to me. She sent a few long-winded emails, each one with a different tone. In one, she was trying to act like she had always supported me, talking about how she never realized the favoritism our parents had shown her, and how she always thought we were close. In another, she framed herself as a victim of our parents' manipulation, saying they'd blinded her to the reality of our family dynamics. But the thing that stood out in every message she somehow always managed to slide in a request for any help during this difficult time. She was trying to act like we were suddenly best friends, but it was clear she still hoped I'd open my wallet for her. It was hard to believe even after my grandparents had taken such drastic steps to set things right. Even after the family backlash, Emma still somehow managed to make it about her and what she could get from me. I felt like I was watching the same story play out all over again. She just couldn't seem to understand boundaries or that I was done being a source of endless support. I was determined not to let her manipulate me back into that role. While this was going on, my parents were busy waging a campaign of their own. They bombarded me with voicemails ranging from angry rants to tearful pleas. In one message, my mom accused me of tearing the family apart, saying I'd regret this one day when I realized how much I'd hurt everyone. In the next, my dad would be begging me to reconsider, saying we could work things out privately and that it didn't have to be a big deal. They even tried guilt-tripping me by saying I was putting my grandparents in an awkward position, and that I needed to think about how they'd feel if the family fractured because of all this. But their tactics weren't working. My grandparents were behind me and the rest of the family were seeing my parents' true colors. Some of them even reached out to tell me they were proud of me for standing my ground. My aunt called me in tears, apologizing for not seeing how differently my parents treated me over the years. She said she'd always assumed I was just more independent and didn't need as much support, but now she realized I'd been forced into that role because my parents had put so much focus on Emma. As the family started to see what I'd been dealing with, more people reached out with apologies or stories about things they'd noticed over the years. It was bittersweet. Part of me was relieved that the truth was finally coming out, that people were recognizing the sacrifices I'd made on my own. But another part of me felt like I was reliving years of hurt and rejection. All those times I'd felt invisible. All those moments where I'd wondered why my achievements didn't seem to matter as much. It all made sense now, but it didn't erase the years of feeling like I was second best. The aftermath of all this has been exhausting. My parents still refuse to accept responsibility for any of it. They're so focused on the family's reputation that they can't see the damage they've caused. To them, this is just another argument that I should let go of for the sake of peace, and they're desperate to keep this whole situation under wraps, but I don't feel guilty anymore for standing up for myself. I think I'm finally seeing how important it is to set boundaries even with family. If I give in now, it'll just mean more years of being used and taken for granted. For the first time, I feel like I'm in control of my own life. My grandparents have assured me that they'll handle my parents if they try to push this any further. They've made it clear that they don't want me to feel pressured, and they even told me that if my parents try to keep stirring things up, they're prepared to take additional steps to protect me. Just knowing that I don't have to go through this alone has made a world of difference. Now I'm left wondering what family even means at this point. All these years I thought being a good son and brother meant putting everyone else first, sacrificing my own needs to make sure everyone else was okay. But now I realize that there's a limit, and family isn't supposed to make you feel like an ATM or ignore your own happiness just because it's convenient. As everything continues to play out, I'm staying firm in my decision, but there's a part of me that wonders if I should be doing something more or handling this differently. I'd really appreciate any advice on how to move forward. There's still so much to process, and I'm trying to take things one day at a time. Update 2. Just a couple of days after my grandparents made their big announcement about the will, my parents finally broke their silence. Instead of apologizing or admitting they might have gone too far, they sent a long, carefully crafted email that tried to justify every decision they'd ever made. They didn't just defend favoring Emma. They practically celebrated it, calling it an investment because Emma, according to them, had always been more family-oriented. Meanwhile, I was described as independent and career-focused, which to them apparently meant I didn't need as much support. They went on to explain that their request for me to step in and fund Emma's life wasn't about money at all. They saw it as balancing things out, helping Emma have the same advantages they felt I'd had on my own. To add salt to the wound, they called me selfish for not wanting to share my excess wealth with my family. The email wasn't just words either. They attached a list itemizing everything they claimed they'd ever spent on me versus on Emma. I'm talking about everything. Even childhood essentials like food, clothes, and housing. For Emma, they listed her wedding expenses, house payments, and even things like therapy after her divorces. They even included a line about Emma's emotional support during her teenage years, value incalculable. It was so outrageous that I realized they'd been thinking about this stuff for a long time, probably hoping one day they could throw it back at me. Apparently, they'd shared this email with the entire extended family too, hoping to paint me as the selfish one, but it totally backfired. Relatives who'd been neutral started reaching out to me, shocked by what they saw as an absurd attempt to bill me for basic parenting. Some even apologized for not realizing the level of favoritism I've been dealing with. I think my parents expected people to rally behind them, but all they did was push everyone further away. Adding to all this, my grandparents' lawyer got involved. My grandparents had always assumed that any money they'd given my parents over the years was being split between me and Emma for our education and other necessary expenses. Now, they were discovering that money had gone toward things like Emma's weddings and her various failed relationships. The lawyer sent my parents an official letter demanding a full account of where the money had gone. The grandparents were ready to take this to court if needed, and honestly, I didn't blame them. They felt betrayed, and I did too. It was like a twisted web of deception that had been building for years with me on the outside the entire time. In a weird twist, Emma's first ex-husband got in touch with me. He's the father of her two oldest kids, and while we'd never been close, we stayed civil. He told me he'd heard about everything going on and wanted to share his side of things. He revealed that my parents had pressured him into marrying Emma when she got pregnant, promising financial support as long as he went through with the marriage. I'd known their marriage was quick, but I hadn't realized my parents had been so involved. Apparently, most of the support my parents had provided came from the money they'd gotten from my grandparents, money my grandparents had assumed was going towards both Emma's and my futures. Emma's ex even apologized, saying he regretted not standing up to them and letting things spiral out of control. My parents quickly realized the email wasn't having the effect they'd hoped, so they tried to backtrack. They sent out a follow-up message to everyone claiming the original email was written in anger and shouldn't be taken too seriously. But it was hard to believe that excuse when their email had clearly been planned out for a while. They might as well have printed and mailed it as an official document with how precise it was. Trying to take it back now only made them look even worse, and nobody bought it. Emma had been quiet for a few days after the family meeting, but then she started reaching out again. Her tone had shifted from guilt-tripping to something more desperate. She sent a few emails hinting that she always loved me and didn't realize our parents had treated us so differently. She even tried to spin her situation, saying she'd never wanted to burden me but was in a difficult spot with her kids. Her texts got stranger, alternating between nostalgic memories from childhood and reminders of how hard things were for her with 6 kids and a struggling husband. At one point she talked about her husband's business challenges and hinted that her kids were having trouble in school because of all the stress at home. It was hard not to feel a bit bad for Emma and her kids, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore everything that had happened. She had known about our parents' favoritism for years and had taken advantage of it while I was left to fend for myself. Now that she was struggling, she wanted me to step in and bail her out. Her emails didn't make me angry as much as they made me sad. She was my sister and her kids were innocent in all this, but it wasn't my responsibility to rescue her from a situation she'd helped create. More family members started coming forward with stories. One of my aunts reached out, apologizing for never saying anything when she noticed things didn't seem fair between Emma and me. She remembered moments when my parents clearly favored Emma and brushed me off, but she hadn't wanted to get involved at the time. She even mentioned that she'd once offered to help me with my college applications, but my parents had waved her off, saying I had it all under control. In reality, I was handling everything on my own, juggling school, applications, and work. My aunt said she hadn't realized just how much I'd been left alone to manage, and she felt guilty for not stepping in sooner. Family group chats became a whole new level of awkward. Relatives kept reaching out asking if there was anything I needed or if they could support me in any way. It was strange to suddenly have all these people offering help and sympathy, especially since they'd never been this involved in my life before. I appreciated their kindness, but it was overwhelming. Part of me felt like I shouldn't need their support now. I'd already gotten through the hardest parts on my own. I mostly just thanked them, unsure of what else to say. Even my parents' closest friends started distancing themselves. A few had believed their side of the story, that I was a workaholic who didn't prioritize family, but after reading the email and hearing more details, they started seeing through my parents' excuses. Some even reached out to apologize, admitting they'd been wrong to judge me. One of them even mentioned that my parents had borrowed money from them, saying it was for family needs. They'd assumed it was for essential expenses, but now they were wondering if they'd actually been funding Emma's lifestyle. Despite everything my parents kept pushing, they continued sending messages claiming that I owe them for everything they'd done for me, that I was responsible for keeping the family together, and that my refusal to support Emma was tearing the family apart. They said I was ruining everything, destroying their reputation, hurting Emma's kids. It was frustrating because they were ignoring their own actions, pretending none of this was their fault. For now, I'm holding my ground. I refuse to let myself be guilted into fixing problems that my parents created or to take responsibility for Emma's choices. It's still hard to believe this is my family, that things reach the point where I have to choose between my own well-being and what they call family loyalty. It's a lot to process, and honestly, I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time I feel like I'm standing up for myself and finally being heard. That, at least, is a step in the right direction. Update 3. The situation has reached to some sort of conclusion, one that no one in the family could have anticipated. My grandparents, after all the mess and hidden issues that surfaced, decided to take a firm stand. They called one final family meeting, and this time with their lawyer present. It felt surreal, like a chapter was closing, but with so many wounds and unresolved feelings still lingering in the air. Yet this wasn't just about talk. My grandparents had a plan, and they weren't wasting any more time. They announced that they'd not only updated their will but were taking immediate action with their assets to prevent any further misuse. For years, my parents had been living rent-free in a family-owned vacation property. It was meant to be a temporary setup, but my parents had made it into their full-time residence, assuming it would eventually be passed down to them. But that's over now. My grandparents are selling the property, and they're planning to use the proceeds to create educational trusts for all the great-grandchildren in the family. This includes Emma's kids as well as my cousin's children. To make it clear that there wouldn't be any more accidental fund diversions, my grandparents also introduced a restructuring plan.